The front door burst open before I could utter a single word. There I stood in my own living room, holding my 1-year-old daughter against my hip, still dressed in my military uniform, while my husband's entire family stared at me as if I'd committed an unforgivable crime. My husband, Marcus, had just thrown a DNA test onto the coffee table and declared with ice in his voice that the child wasn't his. Then his mother jabbed her finger toward the door and screamed for me to get out of her house. That's when the front door opened again, and the man who entered made everyone in that room fall completely silent. Let me rewind a bit. That morning, I'd been at the military base, finishing up paperwork after an extended period of training and administrative duties. I felt that bone-deep military exhaustion that seeps into every fiber of your being, but I was happy because I was finally heading home. My daughter Lily was at the daycare near base, and all I could think about was scooping her up, kissing those soft little cheeks, and driving home to sleep in my own bed for once. Around mid-afternoon, my phone vibrated with a message from Marcus telling me not to be late because his mother had prepared a surprise for me. I stared at that text and actually smiled, thinking maybe, after months of cold conversations and exchanges that felt more like status reports than marriage, Marcus was finally trying to make things work. Maybe his mother Victoria had decided to welcome me instead of treating my military service like some personal inconvenience to her family. I texted back that I'd be there by 6. When I picked up Lily, she reached for me with both tiny arms, babbling, "Mama, Mama," as if she'd been storing up stories all day just to tell me. I buckled her into her car seat, adjusted the little bow in her hair, and drove home with the windows cracked open, smiling almost the entire drive. I actually remember thinking this might be the beginning of something better between us all. The house looked inviting when I pulled into the driveway, lights glowing warmly, cars lined up along the street, including Marcus's truck, his sister's SUV, and his uncle's sedan. I even laughed softly to myself, thinking Victoria had really gone all out for whatever this surprise was supposed to be. But when I carried Lily up those steps and pushed open the front door, all that warmth evaporated instantly. The living room was crammed with people, Marcus's relatives packed onto every available surface, couches, folding chairs, even standing against the walls, and not a single person said hello or stood up or smiled. Marcus stood near the coffee table with Victoria positioned beside him like she was awaiting some kind of verdict. When I asked what was happening, Marcus reached down, grabbed a white envelope, and slammed the paper onto the table, announcing it was DNA, test results proving the child wasn't his. For a moment, I literally couldn't breathe while Lily grabbed at my collar, confused by the sudden hostile silence. Victoria stepped forward with a hard expression and said they knew what I'd done, that I'd humiliated their family, then pointed at the door demanding I leave her house immediately. Before I could respond, the front door swung open behind me, and a deep voice called out, "Captain Mitchell." Everyone turned to see Lieutenant General William Hayes, stepping into the room wearing his full dress uniform. For several long moments, nobody moved a muscle. The general stood there with 3 stars on each shoulder. A man who didn't need to raise his voice to command absolute attention because his presence alone transformed the entire atmosphere. I instinctively straightened my posture while balancing Lily and quietly greeted him. He told me to stand at ease, and his eyes swept across the room, taking in the packed living room, the relatives sitting stiffly, Marcus's pale face, Victoria pointing at the door, and finally the tears gathering in Lily's bright eyes. He frowned and said he seemed to have interrupted something. Nobody answered until Marcus swallowed hard and said this was a family matter. The general acknowledged this with a calm voice that somehow made the room even quieter, then looked at me and asked if I was all right. I wanted to answer, but my throat felt too tight, and instead, Lily buried her face against my shoulder and began crying softly. General Hayes took one deliberate step into the room and announced he'd come to congratulate one of his finest officers on her exceptional service, his eyes shifting toward Marcus as he said he wasn't expecting this scene. Marcus forced a nervous smile, saying there had been a misunderstanding, while Victoria quickly jumped in to explain they were just handling some unpleasant family business. The general didn't react, but instead noticed the paper lying on the coffee table and asked if he could examine it. Marcus hesitated before picking it up and handing it over, explaining it was a DNA report. General Hayes adjusted his reading glasses and carefully studied the document while nobody dared speak, and even Lily had stopped crying, as if sensing how tense everything had become. After nearly a minute, he lowered the paper and asked who had ordered this test. Marcus immediately said he did. The general asked where it was performed, and Marcus named some laboratory I'd never heard of. Looking back at the report, the general quietly asked if I had been present when the sample was collected. Marcus looked uncomfortable and admitted I wasn't. When asked if there was a court order or if the chain of custody was documented, Marcus could only stammer that he didn't know. The general folded the report neatly and said he'd spent over 35 years making decisions based on evidence, and this wasn't evidence. Victoria crossed her arms, insisting it proved I'd cheated on her son. But General Hayes calmly shook his head and said no. It only proved someone had printed a report. The room went silent again, while Marcus's relatives exchanged nervous glances. And for the first time since I'd walked through that door, I saw uncertainty on several faces. The general turned to me and asked if I'd ever consented to a DNA test or been informed one was being conducted, and I answered no to both questions. He nodded as if he'd expected this, and when Marcus raised his voice, asking if the general was saying I was innocent, he replied evenly that he was saying accusing someone without verified evidence destroys families. Victoria scoffed that her son deserved the truth, and the general agreed, which was exactly why this family needed an accredited laboratory, not assumptions, accusations, or public humiliation. His words landed heavily as I looked around at the people who'd been staring at me with judgment only minutes earlier now. Avoiding my eyes entirely, General Hayes stepped beside me and said he believed my daughter and I should leave immediately, looking directly at Marcus while strongly suggesting no one make another accusation until the truth was properly established. As I adjusted Lily against my shoulder and turned toward the door, I realized something fundamental had shifted, because for the first time that evening, I wasn't walking away in shame, but with someone who believed I deserved justice. General Hayes walked us all the way to my car, waiting patiently while I struggled with shaking hands to buckle Lily into her car seat. He told me to take a deep breath, and when I looked at him, the tears finally came. As I whispered, I didn't understand how they could do this. He handed me a clean handkerchief from his jacket and said he'd served in the army nearly 4 decades and had seen careers destroyed when people rushed to conclusions, but he'd also seen innocent people survive because they refused to stop telling the truth. When I said I'd never cheated on my husband, he simply said he believed me, and those 3 words nearly broke me. Not because they solved anything, but because they were the first words of trust I'd heard all night. Lily reached through the open car door, wrapping her tiny fingers around my sleeve, calling Mama. And I smiled through my tears, telling her I was okay. The general glanced toward the house and said he'd help me find somewhere safe to stay tonight. I told him I could stay with my friend Sarah, another officer stationed nearby, who I'd gone through training with years earlier. He reached into his pocket and handed me a business card with 2 names written on the back, one belonging to an experienced military legal assistance attorney, and the other a family law attorney who frequently represented military families. He told me if this became a legal matter, not to face it alone, and before leaving, he looked me in the eyes and told me not to try clearing my name by arguing, because people who've already decided you're guilty rarely change their minds from louder arguments, but from being confronted with undeniable facts. Sarah welcomed Lily and me into her home without asking a single question, simply hugging me and saying the guest room was ready, and we'd talk when I was ready. Later that night, after Lily finally fell asleep in a borrowed crib, I sat alone at Sarah's kitchen table while my phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages from Marcus. 23 missed calls, 7 voicemails, dozens of texts that started angry, asking where I'd gone and saying running away made me look guilty, then became demanding, saying we needed to finish this tonight, and finally one message that caught my attention, claiming his mother said I'd left too quickly to explain myself. I stared at the screen in disbelief because Victoria had literally pointed at the door and screamed for me to leave. And now they were pretending I'd walked away voluntarily. Sarah poured me coffee, and when I told her they were already changing the story, she said not to give them another chance. The next morning, I returned to the house while Marcus was supposedly at work, only wanting to get Lily's clothes, diapers, and a few personal items. Victoria wasn't there either, and the house was quiet. As I packed a small suitcase upstairs, I noticed Marcus's laptop sitting open on the desk with the screen dark but not locked. I had no intention of snooping until a notification popped up from someone named Vanessa saying, "Everything went like we planned. She'll never recover from this." My heart stopped as I clicked on the message thread with trembling hands. And what I read over the next few minutes changed everything I believed about my marriage. The conversation revealed this hadn't been an emotional outburst or misunderstanding, but something planned weeks before I came home. There were dozens of messages discussing embarrassing me in front of Marcus's entire family, making sure I left without asking questions, and one that caught my attention immediately from Vanessa, saying once I was gone, selling the house would be easier. Marcus had never mentioned selling our home, and another message showed Marcus saying I'd probably just go back to the army and wouldn't fight him. After 9 years of marriage, he believed he knew exactly how I'd react. I photographed every page of the conversation with my phone, then noticed another folder labeled taxes on the desktop. Inside were PDF files and bank statements showing transfers from our joint savings account, totaling almost $40,000 that had quietly disappeared while I was serving my country. A car door slammed outside, and I froze, seeing Victoria pulling into the driveway when she wasn't supposed to be home. I quickly emailed the photographs to myself, logged out of the laptop, closed it exactly as I'd found it, grabbed Lily's diaper bag, and hurried downstairs. Victoria walked through the front door just as I reached the hallway, her expression immediately hardening as she said she thought she'd told me to stay away. I calmly said I was only there for Lily's things, and when she said I'd already destroyed enough, I looked at her and said I didn't destroy this family. She laughed bitterly, asking if she was supposed to believe that, and I said no. I expected the truth to speak for itself, then walked past her without another word. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to defend myself. I drove straight to the attorney's office, listed on General Hayes's business card. Attorney Catherine Chen welcomed me that afternoon and listened carefully as I described everything that had happened. When I handed her my phone, she slowly scrolled through every photograph, her eyebrows rising as she read. She told me she'd handled military family cases for 22 years and believed my husband hadn't just tried to humiliate me, but had planned to defraud me. The room suddenly felt very quiet as I realized this was no longer just about a fake DNA test, but something much bigger. And Marcus had no idea his own messages had just become the strongest evidence against him. Catherine told me to remain calm, and from this point forward, not to confront my husband or warn him, but let him believe his plan was working. That wasn't easy, because every part of me wanted to drive straight home and demand an explanation, but I followed her advice. Back at Sarah's house, Lily was sitting on the living room rug, happily stacking blocks. And when she looked up and saw me, she laughed as if nothing in the world had changed. I picked her up and kissed her forehead, whispering that she deserved better than this. When Sarah saw the look on my face and asked what the lawyer had said, I showed her the screenshots from Marcus's laptop, and by the time she reached the message about selling the house, she closed her eyes in disbelief. The following morning, Catherine called saying she'd started tracing the financial records, and the money hadn't been spent but moved. Marcus had opened another bank account almost 8 months earlier that I knew nothing about, and most of our joint savings had been quietly transferred there in small amounts, because people often move money gradually hoping it won't be noticed. She'd also found a consultation invoice from a divorce attorney dated almost a month before I returned home, meaning Marcus hadn't made a terrible decision in one emotional evening, but had been preparing while I was still serving my country. The DNA laboratory listed on that report didn't appear to be accredited, meaning the report would likely carry little or no weight in court, so it might not even be legitimate. Marcus hadn't simply believed a fake report. he had chosen to use one. That afternoon, General Hayes called to check on Lily and me, and when his voice became more serious, he said my husband had wanted me to react emotionally and not to give him that victory. After we hung up, I looked out Sarah's kitchen window at Lily chasing bubbles across the backyard, while Sarah laughed beside her, and for the first time in days, I didn't feel broken, but focused. Marcus thought he'd already won, with no idea that every lie he told was becoming another piece of evidence waiting for him in court. The court-approved DNA test was scheduled for the following Tuesday, with Catherine insisting everything be handled through an accredited laboratory, approved by the county court with no shortcuts, because if the truth was on my side, the process would protect it. Marcus arrived 20 minutes late, barely looking at me, while Victoria followed him into the waiting room, carrying herself with the same confidence she'd worn the night she threw me out. Lily sat quietly on my lap, clutching her favorite stuffed bunny, with no idea why so many adults suddenly seemed angry. Catherine whispered for me to stay calm no matter what happened, and the DNA collection itself took less than 15 minutes with a technician gently swabbing Lily's cheek, then Marcus's, then mine, with everything documented, every sample sealed, every signature witnessed exactly the way General Hayes had said real evidence should be handled. As we walked toward the parking lot, Marcus finally spoke, asking if I really thought this would change anything. I looked at him and said the truth already had. He laughed without humor, saying I'd always been good at pretending, but I didn't answer because Catherine had warned me every unnecessary argument only gave him another opportunity to twist my words. So I simply buckled Lily into her car seat and drove away. 3 days later, Catherine called saying the results were in. I arrived at her office less than an hour later, where she placed a sealed envelope on her desk, but didn't open it immediately, instead looking me straight in the eyes, asking if I was ready. She carefully unfolded the report, then smiled, saying the probability of paternity was 99.9999%. For several seconds I couldn't speak as tears rolled down my cheeks, not because I doubted Lily since I never had, but because the truth had finally been put into words no one could argue with. Catherine handed me a tissue and said congratulations. And when I laughed through tears, saying, "That was strange after everything that had happened," she said it wasn't strange, because today the truth had officially replaced the lie. That afternoon, Marcus received the same results, and his response surprised everyone. He didn't apologize or call to ask how Lily was, but sent one short text saying, the lab must have made a mistake. Catherine read the message and shook her head, saying, "When someone refuses to accept evidence, they're no longer searching for the truth." The next morning, Marcus called 6 times, which I didn't answer. Then Victoria left a voicemail saying we needed to talk, which wasn't an apology or concern for Lily, but panic. By then, several relatives who'd attended that confrontation had learned about the official DNA results, and Marcus's younger sister, Emily, was the first to reach out, quietly apologizing over the phone. She said she'd sat there watching everyone accuse me and should have stood up for me, and mentioned that the night I left, she saw Marcus throw another envelope into the fireplace. After hearing about the real DNA test, she thought whatever was inside would have proven he was lying from the beginning. By the end of that week, the story had spread through Marcus's family, not because I told anyone, but because the official DNA results spoke for themselves. People who'd watched me walk out carrying Lily suddenly realized they'd witnessed something very different from what they'd believed. They hadn't seen a guilty woman exposed, but an innocent wife being publicly humiliated. One by one, the phone calls began, from aunts, uncles, cousins, each conversation sounding almost identical, with apologies for sitting silently, for not asking questions, for judging me. I appreciated every apology, but none erased that night or the image of Lily clinging to my uniform while strangers stared at us. A few days later, Catherine called saying she'd received financial discovery records showing Marcus had been transferring money from our joint account to Vanessa, almost $20,000 in total. She also had phone records showing hundreds of calls, late-night conversations, weekend hotel reservations, credit card charges from restaurants Marcus had claimed were work meetings. There were text messages from Marcus to Vanessa saying once the divorce was final, everything would be theirs, and another saying I'd never figure out the DNA report wasn't real. There it was in writing, not suspicion or confusion or jealousy, but a confession that Marcus had known the report was fake from the beginning. That afternoon, my phone rang with a caller ID that surprised me, Vanessa. Her voice sounded nothing like I expected, tired and almost frightened, as she said she knew I probably hated her, but she hadn't known Marcus was still living as my husband. She said he'd told her we were already separated and only stayed married for military benefits. When she learned the truth, she ended things and said she'd regret helping him humiliate me for the rest of her life. She'd already given my attorney everything she had, because Lily deserved better than the lies they'd helped create. After we hung up, I sat quietly in Sarah's backyard, watching Lily chase butterflies through the grass. And looking at my daughter, I realized this fight had never really been about proving I was innocent, but about making sure Lily grew up knowing that truth matters even when lies seem louder. The divorce hearing was scheduled for the second week of September, nearly 4 months after the night Marcus and his family had tried to throw me out. I walked into the courthouse wearing a Navy business suit instead of my military uniform, because Catherine had told me I wasn't there as a soldier, but as a mother. Sarah watched Lily in the waiting area, while Catherine and I entered the courtroom, where Marcus was already seated, looking different, having lost weight, and lost the confidence he'd worn during that confrontation. Victoria sat behind him, avoiding my eyes for the first time. After opening statements, Catherine calmly presented our evidence, including the official DNA report, bank records showing Marcus's hidden account, transfers to Vanessa, text messages discussing the fake DNA report, and screenshots proving the confrontation had been planned before I even came home. Not once did Catherine raise her voice, because she didn't need to, since the evidence spoke for itself. Marcus's attorney attempted to argue his client had acted out of genuine concern, but the judge looked over the documents for several quiet moments, then asked Marcus if he'd known the DNA report hadn't been verified by an accredited laboratory. Marcus hesitated, saying he wasn't sure, and Catherine immediately handed the judge another exhibit, showing Marcus's own text message saying I'd never figure out the DNA report wasn't real. The courtroom became completely silent as the judge adjusted his glasses and addressed Marcus, saying this message-written character reference from General Hayes, that the judge read aloud, saying I'd consistently demonstrated honesty, integrity, and exceptional judgment throughout my military career, and he trusted me completely as an officer and as a parent. Hearing those words nearly brought tears to my eyes, not because they praised me, but because someone had taken the time to defend my character when it mattered most. The hearing lasted nearly 4 hours before the judge announced his decision that primary physical custody of Lily would remain with me. Marcus would receive supervised visitation until completing parenting and family counseling. The hidden money would be returned to the marital estate, and Marcus would reimburse my legal expenses related to the fraudulent DNA claim. When the hearing ended, Marcus slowly approached me outside the courtroom, and for a moment I thought he might finally apologize. Instead, he quietly asked if I really thought I'd won. I looked at Lily sleeping peacefully in her stroller, then back at him, and said this was never about winning, but about protecting our daughter from the consequences of his choices. Without another word, I turned and walked away. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel like someone seeking revenge, but a mother who had finally found justice. Almost 6 months passed before I saw Victoria again. Life had finally settled into something resembling peace, with Lily growing fast, starting to put little sentences together, and insisting on helping me make breakfast every morning, even if helping usually meant dropping blueberries on the floor. I'd returned to full duty, balancing motherhood and my military career, one careful day at a time, and for the first time in years, coming home felt safe. Then one quiet Saturday afternoon, someone knocked on Sarah's door, and when she glanced through the window, she said I'd better see who it was. Standing on the front porch was Victoria, looking not just older, but smaller somehow. The confident woman who'd ordered me out of her house, replaced by a grandmother holding a small white gift bag. When Sarah asked if she should send her away, I thought about it, knowing months earlier I probably would have said yes, but instead I said I'd talk to her. I stepped outside, closing the door behind me, and after several seconds of silence, Victoria said she didn't expect me to forgive her. When I asked why she was here then, she looked down at the gift bag, saying she'd replayed that night in her head every single day, hearing herself yelling at me, watching me stand there with Lily, and never once asking if her own son was telling the truth. She whispered she'd believed him, and I said I knew. She said she'd wanted to protect her family, and I looked at her calmly, saying she'd already had one. For a moment she couldn't speak, and when she finally looked up with tears on her face, she said she'd failed me, and I didn't know what to say because she was right. Victoria slowly handed me the gift bag containing a tiny hand-knitted baby blanket, cream-colored and perfectly preserved, that her mother had made when Marcus was born. She thought Lily should have it, and after I thanked her, she took a deep breath, saying there was another reason she'd come. She wanted the chance to know her granddaughter, and for the first time she didn't call Lily that child, but her granddaughter. It was a small difference, but it mattered. I told her I couldn't pretend none of this had happened, that she'd accused me in front of her entire family and tried to throw us out. She never argued or made excuses, but simply accepted every word. I said I couldn't promise things would ever be the way they were, and she said she wouldn't ask that, but I also wouldn't teach Lily to carry hatred. Victoria's eyes filled with tears again when I said we'd start with short visits, one step at a time, and she quietly said that was more kindness than she deserved. As she walked back to her car, I stood on the porch watching her leave and realized forgiveness wasn't forgetting or pretending the pain never happened, but choosing not to let that pain become Lily's inheritance. And somehow that choice felt stronger than any revenge I could have imagined. 1 year later, my life looked nothing like it had the night I walked into that confrontation, and in many ways it looked better than I'd ever imagined. Lily was almost 3 years old now, racing through the house every morning with the same stuffed bunny she'd clutched during those difficult weeks, filling every room with laughter and reminding me that children have an incredible gift of not measuring life by its worst moments, but by love. I'd accepted a promotion and continued serving, which wasn't just another rank, but represented every early morning, every deployment, every sacrifice, and every moment I'd refused to let someone else's lies define who I was. General Hayes pinned my new rank during a small ceremony attended by fellow officers Sarah and Lily, and afterward he shook my hand, saying he was proud of the officer I'd become, and even prouder of the mother. Those words meant more than any medal I'd ever received. Life wasn't perfect and never would be. Marcus completed the court-required counseling, and over time, his supervised visits gradually became more natural as he began rebuilding a relationship with Lily. Our conversations remained brief and focused entirely on our daughter, the anger that once lived between us slowly fading, not because the past disappeared, but because Lily deserved parents who could put her needs before their pride. Victoria also kept her promise, never pushing for forgiveness, but earning trust one visit at a time, sometimes coming over just to read Lily a story or bring homemade cookies. One afternoon, I found them sitting on the living room floor, wrapping Lily's favorite doll in the little knitted blanket Victoria had given us months earlier. And when Lily looked up smiling and said, "Grandma made baby cozy," Victoria looked at me with tears in her eyes, and I simply smiled back. That was enough. Not every relationship can be restored, and some wounds leave permanent scars, but scars don't always represent weakness. Sometimes they remind us how much we've survived. Looking back, I realized the greatest victory wasn't proving the DNA report was fake, winning in court, recovering the hidden money, or even hearing the apologies. The greatest victory was refusing to become bitter, because bitterness would have stolen something the lies never could: my peace. Today, when people ask how I survived the hardest season of my life, I give them the same answer. The truth didn't save me overnight, but one honest decision at a time. If my story has taught you anything, I hope it's this: never rush to judge someone based on accusations alone, because truth deserves patience, and people deserve the chance to be heard. The strongest form of revenge isn't cruelty, but living with integrity when others expect you to break. protect the people you love, cherish your family, and never let anger become the legacy you leave behind. And if this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone who needed a second chance, I'd be honored if you shared it with them. Feel free to leave a comment with your thoughts or experiences. And if you'd like to hear more stories about courage, justice, and hope, I'd love for you to subscribe and join me again. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take care of yourselves and the people you love.